author of the novels The Tusk That Did the Damage, An Atlas of Unknowns, and the short story collection Aerograms. Her most recent novel, Loot, was longlisted for the 2023 National Book Award and the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction. Yeah! She's an associate professor of English at George Mason University. Julie Otsuka was born and raised in California. She's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and her first novel, When the Emperor Was Divine, won the 2003 Asian American Literary Award and the American Library Association Alex Award. Her second novel, The Buddha in the Attic, was a finalist for the 2011 National Book Award and won the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction. The Buddha in the Attic was an international bestseller and the winner of the prestigious Prix Féminin Étranger. Sorry for that mangled pronunciation. Her third novel, The Swimmers, won the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction in 2023. She lives in New York City. And Jenny Xie was born in Anhui, China, and resides in New York City. She is the author of The Rupture Tense and Eye Level, both finalists for the National Book Award. Her chapbook, Nowhere to Arrive, received the Drinking Gourd Chapbook Poetry Prize. She is taught at Princeton University and NYU and is currently on faculty at Bard College. We're so honored to have all three of them with us today, and we'll begin by hearing them read. And Tanya, maybe we could start with you and just go down the line.
It's such an honor to be here. I used to come here as an MFA student, and just I feel still starstruck by the writers I'm with. But I'm going to read a little bit from the end of the novel. This is we're with a character named Rum, who is a British Indian man, an older man who for a long time was working at a country house as a sort of manager of an Englishwoman's business affairs. And at the end of the novel, he decides to take a big risk and leave that job and travel and to try something new. So apologies, I'm going to mispronounce a bunch of British words at the very beginning here. They pass through Sittingbourne and Faversham, Boughton under Blean. The road thins and widens and thins again, like a snake digesting a series of things. They reach Canterbury through the West Gate and stop for dinner at an inn. Inside, Rum finds himself sitting across from a pale-faced man who spends an agonizing length of time explaining the historical significance of Canterbury. They eat rump steaks and potatoes with port. The man, named Bertie, asks where Rum is from. "I am from India originally," he says. "Ah, thought so." "Where are you from?" says Rum. "Me?" Bertie laughs for some reason. "Here, Liverpool, to be specific." "So what brings you to England from all the way over there?" Among all the possible answers, Rum does not say what first comes to mind. "I am here because you were there." Instead, he says, "I was land agent to Lady Selwyn of Clover Point Castle for many years." Bertie's eyes widen. "That's a fine house. You're lucky to get a job there." Rum allows himself a modest smile and a sip of port. "Yes, it is. Yes, he was." "And where are you headed?" asks Bertie. So far, Rum hasn't told anyone where he is going. He has spoken of a blurry future that consists of travel and leisure, as if the world is his. He hasn't felt that the world was his since he was 5 years old. Maybe it's the port, but Rum, all of a sudden, decides to tell the truth. "To a town in France called Rouen," he says. Bertie chews blankly. Rum presses on. "I am taking another job, as a bookkeeper for a toy shop." "A toy shop?" Bertie's forehead creases. "That's a far cry from Clover Point." "At this age, I wouldn't mind living with a cry," says Rum. Bertie heartily agrees. Newly widowed, he is bound for the south of France, where he plans to drink muscat and sleep with French women who don't mind their men of a riper vintage. Find them he will, along with a viral strain of syphilis that will nibble his brain down to the nodes, leaving him dead by All Saints' Day. "To living with a cry," Bertie says, raising his glass. Rum meets it with his own.
So So I'm going to read a paragraph from the first chapter of my second novel, The Buddha in the Attic, which is about a group of 100 or so young Japanese picture brides or mail order brides sailing from Japan to America about 100 years ago. On the boat, we often stood on the deck for hours with the wind in our hair, watching the other passengers go by. We saw Turban 6 from the Punjab who were fleeing to Panama from their native land. We saw wealthy white Russians who were fleeing the revolution. We saw Chinese laborers from Hong Kong who were going to work in the cotton fields of Peru. We saw King Lee Uvanovich and his famous band of gypsies who owned a large cattle ranch in Mexico and were rumored to be the richest band of gypsies in the world. We saw a trio of sunburned German tourists and a handsome Spanish priest and a tall, ruddy Englishman named Charles, who appeared at the railing every afternoon at 3:15 and walked several brisk lengths of the deck. Charles was traveling in first class and had dark green eyes and a sharp, pointy nose and spoke perfect Japanese and was the first white person many of us had ever seen. He was a professor of foreign languages at the university in Osaka and had a Japanese wife and a child and had been to America many times and was endlessly patient with our questions. Was it true that Americans had a strong animal odor? Charles laughed and said, "Well, do I?" and let us lean in close for a sniff. And just how hairy were they? About as hairy as I am, Charles replied, and then he rolled up his sleeves to show us his arms, which were covered with dark brown hairs that made us shiver. And did they really grow hair on their chests? Charles blushed and said he could not show us his chest, and we blushed and explained that we had not asked him to. And were there still savage tribes of red Indians wandering all over the prairies? Charles told us that all the red Indians had been taken away, and we breathed a sigh of relief. And was it true that the women in America did not have to kneel down before their husbands or cover their mouths when they laughed? Charles stared at a passing ship on the horizon and then sighed and said, "Sadly, yes." And did the men and women there really dance cheek to cheek all night long? Only on Saturdays, Charles explained. And were the dance steps very difficult? Charles said they were easy and gave us a moonlit lesson on the foxtrot the following evening on the deck. Slow, slow, quick, quick. And was downtown San Francisco truly bigger than the Ginza? Why, of course. And were the houses in America really 3 times the size of our own? Indeed, they were. And did each house have a piano in the front parlor? Charles said it was more like every other house. And did he think we would be happy there? Charles took off his glasses and looked down at us with his lovely green eyes and said, "Oh yes, very."
I will be reading 2 poems from my collection, The Ruptured Tense, which came out of a trip I made to China in 2019. And during this trip, I happened upon the visual archives of the late Chinese photojournalist Li Zhenshen, who's responsible for the most complete visual record of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And this was a decade of anarchy and chaos that every family member a generation above me lived through, but that I felt I had very little access to. And when he was a photojournalist for a state newspaper in China, in an act of boldness and courage that I don't even think he understood at the time, he decided to save negatives that he knew wouldn't be published in the newspaper. And he hid them under his floorboards in his apartment. And he accumulated close to 30,000. And they were smuggled out of China in 1999, over 20 years after the Cultural Revolution ended, and they were seen by the world for the first time in 2003. So seeing these photographs was stunning for me, and I wrote a series of poems, of which I'll read 2. Red Puncta. by negative space, by forgetting's lining, by background, fabric where things seethe, where fugitive looks and tongue trees scrape open loose seams. In the far off, shame plants in earlobes and draws color. See how the background leaks out watery faces that haven't been rifled through, such as the man in the crowd of thousands running his tongue over the film scarring his teeth, such as the woman, her fatty lids betraying her drowsing. The ones farther off, their heads angled away, mouthing the unrecoverable. The background is milky fog, is solitary, is sight that is untold. Edge closer, friction from the future lies in the folds. Red puncta. The girl's face gets caught in the shadow of a Mao placard, so in the print, she's the occluded presence. All around her, helium, balloons, and strings that tether them to fists, right hands raised with copies of the Little Red Book. Nothing is as pronounced as the rash blood of youth. All power knows this. The other girls' bodies conduct a current of faith, but she stands outside of the circuit. A knowability, a deep reaching mold, rendering her all the more lucid. To be cleared of meaning, a kind of freedom only the opaque can claim. Even the loudest metaphor can't get a firm hold on her. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you, all three of you, for those beautiful readings. I'd love to begin with hearing from each of you, since we're thinking about archives and history, how you each used archives and research in the writing process for your books. And I'm particularly curious how you found the things that sparked your way into these books. And Jenny, you were just talking about that photographer, so I'd love to start with how did you find him and his work?
Right, so part of my process, I was in Shanghai, and I happened to have the good fortune of having access to the NYU Shanghai Library, and part of my process those days was just wandering down the stacks of the library and actually plucking titles that felt enticing. And there was one book, I remember, it's a bright ruby red kind of vinyl cover, and I took it down, and it was a book called Red Color News Soldier, which is the book of Li Jianshen's photographs. And I remember opening it, and I don't even know how to describe that sensation of seeing years that your family lived through and they have no visual record of. You know, nobody in my family owned a camera during those years. If you had photographs, they were official portraits that you took in a photography studio in a very, sort of regimented fashion, where the father sits, on the right and the mother sits on the left and the child sits in the middle. And so I had no sense of what those years were like, the brutality, the humiliation, the chaos, and suddenly to be met with these black and white photographs, these stark images of what, some of what conspired then, just halted me. And I remember spending the rest of that afternoon in the library just taking in the book and just wanting to be inside the photographs. And I didn't know what to do with them. For me, at that point in time, I thought just seeing them was overwhelming. And I went back to the US, and then the pandemic happened, and then Li Jianshen died, and his obituary was all over in The Guardian and The Times and The Washington Post. And I found myself thinking back to those images and wondering about how I could write into them and how language could even meet the power, right, the sheer electricity of those photographs. And it was during the pandemic where I was thinking, I don't want to add narrative necessarily or describe the photographs. I wanted to think about the background, about what went unnoticed. And so I titled these poems Red Puncta, and that's after this concept coined by Roland Barthes, punctum of a photograph. So these details in photographs, these accidents in photographs that draw you into a kind of emotional reaction with a photograph, whether that's a woman's necklace that might remind you of your aunts, or a shoe buckle, or a candy wrapper, or dandruff in a man's hair. And so I found myself drawn to these stray background details and wanting to write into them.
That's so beautiful. Julie, how about you?
Yeah, so for my first novel, I was also looking at a lot of photographs, because my training is in visual art, so I'm just very obsessed with how things look, literally. And so Dorothea Lange, do people know who she was? Because she was commissioned by the government, strangely enough, to document the Japanese Americans that were being put in camps at the beginning of World War II. And so I looked at a lot of photographs, and many of them were impounded because they were considered ultimately by the government to be too sympathetic to the Japanese. So I drew on a lot of those photographs for my research for the novel, and then 5 years after the novel was published, 4 years after the novel was published in 2002, the year after 9/11, and in 2006, about 800 of her photographs surfaced in the National Archive, and they've been sitting there for 60 years. And so they were put online because it's the National Archive, so it belongs to everybody. And so a friend of families was looking at the photographs, and he found a photograph of my mother, my uncle, they were children at the time, and my grandmother, was about 40, 1941. It was the moment they had arrived at the temporary assembly center after they'd been removed forcibly from their homes. And the assembly center was in San Bruno, California, right south of San Francisco, and it was a horse racetrack where they spent the summer of 1942. And it was really amazing, just after writing about an era, also that way you were saying, Jenny, which was not photographically documented because the Japanese, by law, were forbidden from bringing cameras with them to the camps. So you don't have a lot of photographic imagery of that time unless it's official, like the photos that Dorothea Lange took. So, and then I feel like there are always details that you see in photos, what you're seeing in the background. And in this photo, it's my grandmother is wearing a very nice wool coat. It's often a Japanese Americans wore their best clothing layered on the day that they left for the camps because they wanted to take as much as they could with them. And my mother is 20 away, she's 10, and you can see two black braids in the back of her hair. And my uncle is 8, you can see him in profile, and he's wearing around his neck canteen, and that's sort of a canvas holder, he's in the Army canteen. And it's because I think, in my mind, this is a story that I made him, we're going to camp, so I think he's imagining a Boy Scout camp, and his mother, my grandmother's mother, think that he's just arrived, and the look on his face is just one of those great, sort of serious alarm that I didn't realize it's not the type of cat that he imagined. But that detail, of course, worked its way into the book, because it was too late. But I do find visual imagery just really fascinating to work with.
Did you guys ever think about using the photographs in your books?
For practical reasons, I didn't linger too much on it. I just wasn't sure what would be involved. But I think I also liked that by leaving them out, you force the reader to imagine, to draw it up in ways that you can't with a one-on-one relationship.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to. Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, and it was too late by the time I found that photograph. But no, it never occurred to me to use the other ones either. I just believe in the power of the word.
Yeah. I don't remember exactly how I came across the object at the center of this novel, which is an automaton called Tipu's Tiger. It's in the V&A Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum in London. But I remember it was at a time when I had written several failed novel drafts, and I was just desperate to find something that would, sustain my interest. And it's a 6-foot-long wooden tiger that's mauling the throat of an English soldier. And when you turn the hand crank, back when it worked, the tiger would sort of grunt, and the soldier would sort of moan and like kind of pathetically flap his arm. And I just, and then also there's like an organ in the body of the tiger that would play like a little soundtrack for this scene. And it was commissioned by a South Indian ruler named Tipu Sultan, who you can probably tell hated the British East India Company. And I just thought it was so unlike any Indian art I had ever seen from that time period, which is not, wouldn't say it's a colonialist, I mean, I wouldn't say it's colonial art because it's a sort of pre-colonial period, but it was just so sinister but funny and kind of grotesque and making fun of imperial power. And I was just sort of obsessed with it, but I also was like, oh God, I really don't want to write a historical fiction. It's like, that's so much homework. And I had written these failed novels, and I was hoping for something a little faster. But I guess these things sort of choose us in a way. The subject sort of chose me. And so I was circling it for a long time, trying to figure out my way into it. But I think ultimately it just became an obsession that I gave to a character in the novel.
I love that there were like photos or a physical art object that fueled each of these books. I think that's so fascinating. And I'm curious, Jenny, one thing you said that I think is so powerful in all your books is that it's the background and the small details that really bring them to life. And I think that's true in each of your books. And I'm curious with research, when you knew you had enough and you shifted from this interrogation and learning to the writing phase. And was that hard? Is my the sub question. Anybody want to jump in first?
I can address that. Yeah, it was hard because there was a point, especially during the pandemic, where I went down a spiral of collecting scholarly books about Maoism and the Cultural Revolution and photography in China. And there always seemed to be 5 more books I could be reading and stacking. And then I had to step back and say, well, I'm not writing a kind of scholarly account, monograph of what's happening, right? And what does poetry do that a nonfiction prose account, a more academic account can't do? And at the same time, I was wrestling with the fact that a lot of the archive is just the presence of silence, of what can't be said because there are state-sanctioned, suppression, or because my family members are very guarded about their past, and rightfully so, because for many years of their lives, if stray details from your life were analyzed, you risked real persecution. And so I was sitting with a lot of what couldn't be said, a lot of holes and pinpricks and things, and just dense silences. And I think I wanted my poetry to be foregrounding that. And I think that, understanding that was a time in which I gave myself permission to step back from trying to just accumulate historical scholarly knowledge about that time period and just play with language and what language and fragment could do in a poem.
Yeah, I feel like that word play is something that I had to keep reminding myself of, in terms of that's what I want to be doing. Because I think, especially with the secondary sources that I was looking at, they were very dense and very detached from the subjects they were trying to represent. And I just, I think in technical terms, my process was just, I would read these books, I would take notes, and I would print them out, and then I would take notes in the side of like, how might historical incidents sort of tilt the story in some way, or tilt these characters? How do I infuse this material with my personality? I felt like that was a way in which the writing was sort of more collaborative than I thought historical fiction could be. I thought, historical fiction, it means sort of accumulating tons of information and then having the authority to tell a story from this place. But I think what was interesting to me about writing it was that it's a lot, I think to me it's sort of finding my own sort of what delights me about this period or this subject matter, even if it's something as bleak as colonialism. Like what are the things I find strange or idiosyncratic? And so it was just that word I think I thought about was play and also lightness. Like, how do I make this feel not like a lesson, but that we are moving kind of quickly through this, information, but you get the sense of where we're at, but really there's sort of a lighter hand in terms of the teaching.
Yeah, I think for me there's a very research-intensive period at the beginning of any novel, and I take a lot of handwritten notes in Claire Fontaine graph paper notebooks. And I think, especially with my first novel, I felt like I was going to tell the story of a Japanese American family being sent to the camps. I really owed it, to my people, to my ancestors, to get the story right. So I did a lot of research for that book, and I think I always probably do much better, okay. Much more research than I need to. I probably use about 2% of the data that I've gathered, and then at a certain point I just begin to write. And when I'm writing, I try to be very sparing with historical detail. I just sprinkle enough detail very lightly throughout the text to make the story feel believable, but I think ultimately what I'm interested in always is just the psychology of the characters in a particular situation.
Julie, I want to stay with you for a second now that your mic is working. I love it.
Oh, sorry.
I'm so curious about how you chose the collective we as the voice for the novel. And I wonder if you could talk about, was it always that way for you, or was it a point when that emerged?
Yeah, no, it was initially, I tried to tell the story of a single picture bride coming from Japan to America to meet her future husband, whom she'd only corresponded with and exchanged photographs with. And it was just falling very, very flat. And then, this is why it's always good to keep old drafts and notes, but I was just looking through my notes, and I just saw this line, which was it's now the first line of the novel, "On the boat we were mostly virgins." And when I saw that line, I knew that would be a great first line for the novel, and then that gave me the idea for the we voice, the first person plural. And it also, I think the form fit the material. I found so many fascinating stories in my research. This was, I think, a case in which, for my first novel about the Japanese American incarceration, I sort of had the bare bones outline of the story, and then I did the research sort of after, just to make sure I was getting things right. But I sort of knew a lot about what I wanted to say before I began to say it. But with the Buddha in the attic, I really knew very little about the picture bride. So really, that was very heavily, the stories that I found, I somehow managed to weave into the book. And using the first person plural allowed me just to tell many, many more stories than I could have otherwise if I just told the story of one young woman.
That makes so much sense, and it is so perfect for the book. Thank you for answering my curious question. Tanya, there's a line of poetry that repeats throughout the novel and also echoes in really interesting ways, and I'd love to hear about that poem and how you found it.
Yeah, this is a woman. There was a woman who's the daughter of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and she was a poet, and she was for a long time in confinement in the Zanana. So my sense of women in these places was that they are, they were confined, and therefore we don't know anything about them, and we can't know anything about them. And that was something I kept running up against in my research, was like, oh, I can't find this information. Libraries were burned where I could have found what courtly life was like. I could have found out, what life was like in the Zanana, but I don't have it. And that, for a long time, felt like a limitation. Like, how am I going to write this? And so, but then I sort of thought, again, this idea of play, like, how can I write into these erasures and gaps? And I found this one line of poetry from this woman who was known as the Hidden One, because she had one book of poetry that I think survives. It's called Book of the Hidden One. And this line of poetry was, if an artist were to draw me for a model, how could he draw the form of a sigh? And I just thought that was incredible. I thought, somehow I want to honor the reality that there were people, there's so many people who had full imaginative lives, who are artists and creators and the heroes of their own stories that we don't have, but how can I kind of pull that into my novel? So I give that line, that verse, to another woman in the novel, and she's not really a character, but the central character of this novel, he hears that line of poetry and he thinks that it just stays with him. And I wanted the novel to kind of pull in a couple different voices from history that are not from the history of this novel, but just, it's a way of kind of inviting the reader to continue looking, that to remind them perhaps that the borders of this novel are porous and that there's a sense of ongoingness beyond this chapter, this period that I'm writing about. So somehow that line of poetry, it mattered to me, it vibrated to me, and so I gave that to a character in the novel, basically.
Oh, I love that story. I'm sticking with poetry for a second. Jenny, in the poem, which I love, Broken Proverbs, you have this line that I can't stop thinking about, which is, it can take millennia to build an archive, seconds for it to turn into a gate. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do archives open in that way?
Yeah, open or close is what I was also thinking about. So much of the visual record of China before the 1970s was destroyed by war and invasion and the Cultural Revolution. So I thought about, all the accumulated traces of people's lives, of these singular details, of things that were candid and not just official portraits or state-sanctioned propaganda photographs that just disappeared. Sometimes within a period of a year or a few years, because that's what the Red Guards were instructed to destroy, evidence of the past. And I was also thinking about my own family members. So on this trip back to China, I was very struck by my aunts and uncles and grandparents aging, and I was aging, and of course, and just realizing that when a person passes, so much of not just historical cultural knowledge, but just singular, indescribable, inarticulate ways of knowing go. And what happens if that knowledge happens to be within a generation that is encouraged not to remember certain episodes of history? And how is that so strange in an age where our memory is more or less archival? I mean, how many of us have at least 20,000 photographs in our pocket right now, right? How many of us depend on memory that is external? And so to think in this time where it's so easy to record each and every thing, your toddler brushing his teeth, the stray sign you saw on your way walking here, how, what the stakes are of someone letting go of entire decades and eras of history that they're encouraged not to remember.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a perfect segue to something that I'd love to hear from all of you about, which I think each of your work deals with intergenerational passing of stories and also families and both absences and presences. And I'm curious how readers have reacted intergenerationally to your work, and if you've seen differences in different ages of readers reacting to it, or if you had a generation of readers in mind when you were writing it.
So when I was on book tour for Emperor, I met a lot of the cities that I went to were on the West Coast, which is where most of the Japanese Americans live. And at that time, there were so many survivors of the camps who were still alive, and they would come to my readings, and it was just amazing to meet these people in person that I've been writing about and thinking about and obsessing about for years while just working on the novel. And so that was just a real gift. And they would tell me stories, and some of them actually worked their way into The Buddha in the Attic, because many of their mothers or grandmothers came over as mail order brides to this country. And so I would hear different iterations of when she got off the boat, she was shocked to learn that her husband was so poor or so old or so ugly or so brown. These men had misrepresented themselves in their photographs and letters. And I don't think it occurred to me then that these people would be gone in 20 years, and now that just that whole generation is gone, and I feel like, you know, that novel was banned by a school board in Wisconsin, and I feel like there is an active just movement to forget certain chapters of our history, and it's a lot harder to tell that story when there are actual survivors who are no longer with us. But I meet a lot of young people now who actually know nothing about, you know, World War II in the camps. So it's a new story for them that they haven't learned about in school. So that's always slightly jarring.
Yeah.
What's the question?
Do you feel like intergenerationally readers are reacting differently to your work? And did you have an ideal reader in mind when you were writing?
I think the ideal reader question was sort of a tough thing for me to resolve at first, because I was trying to figure out how much information do I actually need to convey to a reader, you know, and I kind of think of an ideal reader. Julie and I share the same agent, and I kind of just think of her, to be honest. Because she's usually the first person I send things to, and she has some sense of, you know, she might have some sense of, you know, larger kind of historical context, but, you know, in terms of how much information I want, like what reader I want to keep with me and not lose, I think often of her. But intergenerationally, because this history is so far removed, it's like 200 years, I think what's interesting is to look at Indian reader responses versus American versus British. And I think in British there's been a much more of an interest in kind of hearing about literature that speaks to the repatriation movement, and there's, you know, more artists who are kind of responding to the history of British Empire, which is, you know, British history itself. And I think in India it's interesting because the guy who commissioned this piece is a very controversial figure. So sometimes I'll hear from people who haven't read the book, like I have relatives from Kerala who were like, don't make him into some kind of hero, because he, as if this happened 20 years ago, he invaded our area and he destroyed all these things, and so don't try to make him into some kind of, and so, and then I have other people from other places who are like, he was totally a hero, he was a national hero, and so there's a lot of kind of claiming of this one figure who really occupies a very narrow sliver of the novel. So in some ways I feel like I was completely ignorant of all this when I started writing, and I'm glad that I was ignorant, because I think if I had known that people have so many strong opinions about this person, it would have been hard to kind of find my way to sort of be irreverent about, you know, playing with his story. But those sort of different readings has been interesting to look at. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I don't think I had a particular reader in mind when I was writing. I don't usually, unless it's some version of myself. But I think I wanted it to reach someone who was curious, not just about Chinese historical knowledge and the Cultural Revolution years, but also about things such as how photography is forward-facing. You know, how when we look at a photograph, for most of us, the first thing that comes to mind is it's an arresting of a moment in the past, but the photographer, the person behind the lens, those in the camera's frame are thinking about how they'll be remembered in the future tense, right? And so I was thinking about that kind of alchemy that happens when you look at a photograph, that you're almost time traveling. And those were, you know, I wanted the poems to reach someone and to stir in them or displace in them some feeling about just how strange memory and time passing can be, and the loss of memory. I would say, in terms of reactions and people I've engaged with who've read the book, I've been really pleased that people actually look at the photographs of Li Jianchen. So if you Google him, you will see some of this incredible, extraordinary archive of his that's out there, published both in Red Color News Soldier, but also online in public media outlets. And I've also been really moved to talk with other, diasporic populations who are reckoning with this idea of post-memory. So people who didn't directly experience some traumatic episode of the past, but are experiencing it through their parents or relatives' recountings of it, or their silences around it, or the ways it erupts or infuses in strange behaviors, right? And how do you, I think, so many of us who are artists and writers are trying to figure out ways to make sense of what we can add to that conversation, right? What can you have a claim on to write about? How do you think about post-memory? What can fiction and poetry and song and film do to memories that are not yours, that can still enliven them and vivify them? So it felt really good to suddenly feel part of that conversation that I wasn't so much thinking about when I was working in solitude.
I think all three of your books are exactly answers to that question. It's so beautifully said. We are all the lucky readers to have the gifts of all three of your books and the windows into the pasts and the silences that they provide. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for being here.